I am so honored to have with me here the incredible scholars, educators, contributors to Latinx TV in the 21st century. Ryan, I know you got a copy.
I do indeed.
Yay! So excited. This is really, really quite the volume, quite the I think seminal kind of foundational work on 21st century Latinx TV. José Muñoz is associate professor of sociology at Cal State University San Bernardino, publishing articles in social movement studies, Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences, Sociology, Migration and Development, Migration Letters. He teaches courses in qualitative methods, theory, Latino health, Chicano social stratification, migration, and social movements. Jose has also co-created this chapter for us. He and his extraordinary team of scholars there at Cal State University San Bernardino, focusing their sights on one day at a time, the reboot, and how it clears new narrative space for reconstructions of Latinx mental health issues. To do so, they also critically examine how the media industrial complex has portrayed Latinxs, Latinos, Latinas with mental health issues as either drug addicts, violent offenders, or sociopaths. Ryan Rashotte is assistant professor of English at Temple University, the branch in Japan, and the author of numerous articles, as well as the book Narco Cinema, Sex, Drugs, and Banda Music in Mexico's B Filmography. For Latinx TV in the 21st century, Ryan digs deep into the show Narcos Mexico, examining how it at once uses hyperviolence and a prestige TV production style to shape and solidify a grand Narcos mythology. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really excited that this book is in the world. It's in our hands and about to be in the world and many others' hands. Let me just ask, some kind of fun questions. Like, Ryan, let me start with you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got into, doing research, writing, and teaching on Latinx TV.
I guess the short version, if I can compress maybe about 15 years or so, when I was a graduate student doing my dissertation, I had a chapter on drug tourism in Mexico. And that sort of kindled an interest just in narco culture generally. And then when I finished my PhD, I started researching a book on narco cinema, which is kind of a B cinema about drug culture in Mexico and the US borderlands. So that was sort of my big passion for a number of years. And then that sort of spawned an interest just in narco culture, all things narco culture, essentially. So when Netflix released the first installment of Narcos about Pablo Escobar in Colombia, drug culture, I consumed that like a drug itself. And then when they finally released the version about Narcos Mexico, and that for me was just sort of the purest form of entertainment, because I had spent so much time researching sort of Mexican narco culture, and to see it sort of articulated by some leading Latinx auteurs was just all I could have asked for. So I was so excited to write this chapter about that version of Narcos for Netflix.
I have a lot of kind of, I don't know if you've been following also like the stuff like Ozark and, have you, yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
And then there was the Coyote, ABC, and, all of these things where you have these kind of what I call elsewhere kind of regenerative narratives of whiteness in and through, the space. But we'll get back to that in a second. I want to ask you, Jose, also just kind of to share a little bit about your journey and how you got to this space, because in many ways, this at least not from my side of the table, because I know you and your interests, but for some it might be, wow, okay, so now Jose is doing media studies.
Yeah. I always talk about media in my classrooms, whether it's sociological theory or qualitative methods. And I actually did write a master's thesis on the ways in which teachers and professors are portrayed in TV and film. But it was a class that I taught at Cal State San Bernardino called Latino Health. And I remember scrolling through some webpage looking at different films that portray mental illness. And I scrolled through a ton of them and I realized, hey, there's no Latino leads or faces in any of these films. And then there was only one non-white film that I noticed. So I brought this up to my students the next day, telling them about my struggle to find content in English about Latinos with mental health conditions. And a student mentioned, oh, have you started watching One Day at a Time? And then I said no, and that's where it clicked. I started to watch that show and I put a student to work eventually, track down any content you can find on the ways in which Latinos are portrayed with mental health conditions. And that's sort of how it started. And then I got a group of students to begin to work with me on this. And we stuck at it for like 3 to 6 months, just sort of teasing out what we found in these images. And I was happy to have this opportunity to publish work with my students in Latinx TV.
So amazing. It's our scholarship and education kind of in action, you know, this collaboration that you were able to do with your students.
Yeah.
Were there any surprises in this, not only in what you've discovered, but also in the collaboration itself?
Well, I think the students did a great job in sort of applying what I tried to teach in the classroom on content analysis. I think their thoughtfulness was a big surprise, and well, a big surprise in the sense that they took the ideas that we began to form and really just ran with them. And then one student in particular started to play with a particular theory that I wanted to apply, which is used at the end of the book, and began to play with how do we begin to map this in a table format. And that was really eye-opening to see a student just sort of run with some of the things I've tried to teach in class. And so that was that was very fruitful, and I was very proud of them for all the different kinds of roles that they played in the project.
So amazing, so incredible. Ryan, maybe you can, were there surprises for you? I know that this is work in an area that you've been working on for, well, as you mentioned, at least 15 years, but in the work on Narco Mexico.
Not really surprises. It was just more curiosity about how they would handle certain events, historical events. And so kind of comparing it to sort of some of the B cinema that I've been watching years before, it was just sort of, it was amazing how just beautiful some of the events were portrayed. I mean, that's why I focus so much on aesthetics in the chapter, because it was just it's a huge sort of aesthetic leap from what I was used to in seeing some of these characters portrayed and some of these events in narco culture portrayed.
You know, Ryan, was there ever a moment, I mean, I know there was, where you started to kind of put pressure on kind of aesthetics and stylization and not so much maybe sentimentality, but a kind of romanticizing?
Yeah, but it was such a different kind of way of romanticizing than I was used to as well. And and as you said, it was kind of purely aesthetic. I can kind of pinpoint it to one scene. I didn't focus too much on it in the chapter, but there was a scene in the second season of Narcos Mexico that begins with a member of the Tijuana cartel waking up and sort of getting dressed. It's like the 80s, and just something about his swagger and the way he kind of proceeds to go on to the park, and then he takes a machine gun and he does kind of a target practice with this sort of with these fish, like in front of these families. And it was just such an unusual scene that really sort of focused or just forced your attention onto the aesthetic quality of the TV show, because it really served no larger narrative purpose. Mm-hmm. So at that point, I sort of realized that, you know, this was in many senses like an auteur kind of depiction of narco culture.
You know, Jose, in your work on One Day at a Time, the reboot, what was particularly what grabbed you about the writing of the show itself, and representation of Latinxes and mental health and, health wellness?
Mhm. Well, I think the show does a great job of exploring Latinx identities in a way that we don't typically see in sitcom kinds of TV shows. So I do think they were, even though it's a reboot, I do think they were trying some things that we don't typically see. But specifically with mental health, I think the show does a great job in sort of walking people through uh, how someone with a mental health condition, in this case, depression, sort of goes through these series of stages, which we write about at the end of that chapter. And it does it in a way that allows someone to begin to understand how someone how someone comes to the point of understanding for themselves their own mental health issues. And I think we don't typically see that in television, or and I think that's what the show has really done extraordinarily well. And I think it's a great model for people to begin to understand, how do you talk to your families about this? How do you gauge your own awareness about your own mental health conditions? What kinds of resources are out there in either group therapy or one-on-one? And I think the show does that really well over a couple of seasons, which again is extraordinary.
Why does, if someone comes up to us, and a family member, just someone that we meet randomly, and we tell them, we give them the elevator pitch of our work here in this particular volume. How do you tell them why this stuff matters? Like, how do we articulate that? Why does it matter to you, Brian? Why does it matter to you, Jose? And finally, why does it sort of matter to, for us to bring this into our classrooms? Ryan?
I guess, I mean, the larger question itself is, why does narco culture matter? Why is it something that sort of that needs to be more visible in regular culture? And I think just because it's been sort of a tool to demonize Latinx and other populations for so long, that, I mean, it's essential just to sort of realize not only just how strongly drugs impact culture, but just sort of the history of that impact itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And so kind of asking us to take a pause and to, in a way, dishabituate, right? Because there's just, this stuff is on us all the time. We just become habituated to it. And what you're doing is saying, hold on, slow down. I want us to stop a minute, and I'm going to not only show us something, I'm going to provide us with some concepts for us to kind of untangle and understand this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Habituate is a great term to use for that as well, talking about drug culture specifically.
Yeah. Jose, how about for you?
Well, I think as far as the mental health aspect of the chapter, or I mean the entire chapter, really, it's important for people who are non-white to see other possibilities, struggles, challenges in working through mental health. And I think that's what the second part of the chapter is trying to do. But I also think the content is important because it's clear that mental health qualities that are attributable or attributed to Latino characters becomes a way of reinforcing the stereotypes that are already out there. So it becomes another mechanism for driving home this very clear box that Latinos are placed into. And I apart from having this chapter, I do talk about these themes now in my classroom on a regular basis. So it's important to point out these, not only the process for uncovering and critically analyzing media content, but what can we learn? And like you pointed out, why does it matter? And that's an important question for students to be confronted with, so that they can learn to be critical of the content that they watch. And I actually see myself in the future creating a sociology of the media class and using a lot of the content that I've begun to look at in that class. Yeah.
speaking of future, a future maybe even as indicated or gestured toward in the present, is there a TV show, Latinx or otherwise, Latino or otherwise, that really is kind of innovating and at the cutting edge, that seems to do things, you know, in ways that you want to see more of in the future? And in that future, if we are in a kind of ideal world, what would you like to see more of? Ryan.
Well, I'll stick with Narcos Mexico because I think it has evolved, and I'm kind of proud of the way it's evolved over the past several seasons now. Like, it started off with the Colombia version. The first season was very much sort of the white savior trope, where you had this sort of blonde DEA agent who came down and was going to solve all the problems there. But I think the producers realized early on that narrative wasn't going to work anymore. It's been played out. So I'd like to see the show evolve the way it has been, where it's not just sort of the binary between sort of the two kinds of ambivalence, sort of the American DEA ambivalence, which is more just about sort of their frustration with the way the drug wars played out, and then the sort of Latinx, or in the case of the second season, the Mexican sort of cartel ambivalence, which is sort of, you know, that conflict between becoming hugely successful and serving your community as well. In the last season, which I didn't get a chance to write about in this chapter, it came out afterwards, but you started to see more of kind of a David Simon trajectory, where it wasn't just sort of the good guys and the bad guys, but there were sort of the smaller members who were impacted by narco culture as well. The police officer in Juarez, and then sort of more kind of smaller cartel figures as well. I'd like to see it branch out into sort of this larger sociological dimension, where you're looking at sort of all levels of people who play a role in narco culture, whether they realize it or not, as well, on both sides of the border. So kind of seeing more of a David Simon trajectory in future seasons, which unfortunately is not going to happen. I guess they're ending after this third season, but that would be my ideal going forward.
Yeah, no, that's really awesome. And Jose, speaking of not going forward, of course, one day at a time, we had those, like, it's, you know, and then suddenly it stops, and then we have social media pushback and we get it back, thankfully, et cetera. But I think it's finally, you know, no longer. But what about you in terms of this kind of innovative space and where you'd like to see things going?
Well, I'm gonna take a big detour, and I sort of took your question to think about what do I like that's out there that I watch on a regular basis, and I like the show The Expanse. It's doing some very interesting things, and it's also in sci-fi where we see a lot of non-whites in this genre. I'm also thinking about the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, and almost playing the Aldama character, and so I do see sci-fi as one of those spaces where you do see not only non-whites but Latinos as well from time to time, and so I think that could be a future project. I don't know. And then certainly the Walking Dead and the Fear the Walking Dead, where we do see Latino characters play major roles and sort of sidekick kinds of roles, and I think that show also has a lot to say about how communities form, how they crumble, and how do they come back again, and how do the characters in those shows sort of work towards that, apart from dealing with the conflicts that they're facing, and the zombies, of course. But yeah, it's that area of TV and film is what really excites me. So yeah.
Me too, absolutely. Well, we know that the study, the writing, the scholarship, the research on Latinx TV, Latino TV, media, film, social media platforms, all of this stuff matters, and it matters because of the incredible work that you both are doing, and all of the scholars that have contributed to Latinx TV in the 21st century. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm excited for our book.
Yeah, me too. Pretty pumped. Thank you.
Cool.